Hey everyone, before we jump into today's episode, I want to give a quick shout out to our sponsor of the show, Procurify. If you've enjoyed the content we put out here, a great way to say thank you, after obviously giving us a 5-star review and sharing with your friends, is checking out Procurify. Procurify is the procure-to-pay platform for charter schools. Basically, that means they help your school manage all the various manual aspects of the purchasing process in one platform. You can learn more at byq.org/procurify. That's PROCURIFY. All right, now back to the show.
Welcome to Charter School Insider, lessons from the nation's top charter school operators, the only podcast dedicated to the behind-the-scenes business of running a successful charter school. Join us as we sit down with charter school leaders who share how they are overcoming the biggest operational hurdles facing their schools today.
All right, Zainab, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks so much, Daniel, for having me.
I thought we could start with just a quick intro on you. You're an executive in residence at the Charter School Growth Fund, and a lot of people have heard of the Growth Fund, but maybe some people haven't. And so I thought we could start with just a quick intro on you, your background, and then if you could provide kind of the super quick summary on who CSGF is.
Yeah. So I've been working in K-12 public education my entire career. I've worked on the district side in New York City during the Bloomberg administration, for the New York City Schools Chancellor, in the Camden City School District in South Jersey, and at Charter Network in Los Angeles called Alliance College Ready Public Schools, which is the largest and one of the most successful. And 3 years ago, I joined Charter School Growth Fund and have been working on teacher culture, satisfaction, and those types of issues since then. And it's been really wonderful.
Awesome. Well, the last 3 years have certainly been a challenge as it relates to teacher culture, retention, sort of staff development, which is our topic for today. So I'm really excited to get into that more. But what about the Growth Fund? Could you provide just sort of some broad strokes on the work the Growth Fund does?
Yep. So Charter School Growth Fund, we believe that every child should have access to great public schools. And we believe in supporting the right visionary leaders who can transform public education in their communities. And so we invest in the best charter schools across the country. We provide them with the financial resources and strategic guidance that they need to grow and to innovate. And we currently have a little bit more, around 1,200 charter schools across the country that we support.
Fantastic. Yeah, if you're not familiar with the Growth Fund, definitely encourage you to check out the website. They offer a variety of different grant programs, incredible support on the resource side. And so we'll link to a lot of that in the show notes. But for those who are unfamiliar, definitely would encourage you to check out CSGF. So let's get back to our topic, which is diving into a recent research report that you've been working on exploring teacher retention and sustainability. This is a huge challenge. And frankly, I feel like every conversation I have with leaders, this is one of the top things that comes to mind as it relates to challenges. It's budget and how do we keep our people and retain them and grow them. And so it probably makes sense to start with sort of a basic question, which is what prompted this study and kind of why is it so relevant, from your perspective?
Yeah, well, look, like the past 5 years on the talent landscape, the world has dramatically shifted. So that is the backdrop post-pandemic, with so many workers moving to remote work or partially remote work, with the influx of Gen Z in the workplace. And so that's sort of the backdrop of what we're operating within. And then over the past year, 18 months or so in my role and with my colleagues, we kept hearing over and over from leaders about how they were struggling with teacher retention, like you said. And at the same time, we also knew that there were a number of charter networks and schools across the country that were trying to address this issue through really specific strategies. I'm sure you have heard people talk about the 4-day work week. There were a lot of different ideas like this, including ideas around compensation or getting creative with the workday or how you staff the classroom. And so we decided to start with those who we thought were already doing this work really well.
Okay, so you all essentially said, let's go find the organizations that are having some success here and let's kind of dissect what's working. Tell us a little bit about the process. Like whenever you do a research report, everyone has their own methodology and kind of system and process for doing these things. Could you talk us through like what type of data did you actually collect? Who were you interviewing? Are these big networks? Are these small schools?
Yeah.
Give us sort of the rundown.
So this is not meant to be an academic research report. So we are not passing it off as that. We believe at CSGF that some of the best answers come from the portfolio. And so that's where we wanted to start, was who is doing this work really well and what are they doing? What's their special sauce? And so we went to the charter networks and schools that were in the top quartile of teacher retention in the portfolio. So that was around anything above 80%. Some weren't quite there, but we knew that they had been investing heavily in this work the past couple years. And so we also wanted to learn from some of them. And the group ended up being representative of the diversity of the portfolio. So ranging from one single site school all the way to a charter network that had 60 schools. And then geography wise, everywhere from the West Coast, Rocky Mountain, the Northeast, the Midwest, and then also a diversity in grade span. So networks that were pre-K to 12, schools that were pre-K to 3, K-8s, et cetera. So there is a lot of different folks in the mix.
Love it. So essentially, this is applicable to anyone. This is not just K-5 schools in the Midwest or something like that, or young teachers who've moved to New York City and want to do the big city thing. And so this is only, applicable to them. This is kind of nationally, what are you seeing that's working regardless of shape, size, grade level, et cetera?
Yeah. The details sometimes, are a little bit different, right? At scale or at a single site, but the gist, like the general approach and what we heard, continued to be the same across the board.
Okay, cool. Well, I'm excited to get into some of the learnings and principles. I'm wondering if you or your team who worked on this had some preconceived notions about what you might hear. I think the layperson might say, well, this is an obvious problem. Pay teachers more, fix that, and then they'll all stay. What were you all thinking going into this report? And, before we get into the exact specifics, could you tell us whether or not you were surprised or maybe validated by what you found?
Yeah, that was actually a huge component of this process. So I went in thinking we're going to have this report that has really sexy examples of turnkey talent innovation practices like the 4-day work week or like a shifting, classroom staffing model or a new approach to the workday, really exciting rewards programs or compensation structures we had never heard of. And instead, we heard over and over that investing in any one talent strategy in isolation is not the answer. And in fact, a focus on any one of those things without a strong, healthy leadership, culture, vision for leadership and staff development, without all of those things in place, that these one-off or single strategies can actually create an adverse impact on retention and overall culture. Or you may get a quick hit and get some wins for a year, but it's not going to be sustainable in the long term.
Interesting. Okay, so what I'd like to do is I want to talk through the kind of 5 major insights or takeaways. So the way the report is structured, and we'll post a summary in the show notes for folks to go back and read through these kind of 5 key takeaways. But the way it's structured is there's sort of 5 insights or findings based on the broad range of interviews and research you all did. And what I want to do is kind of just go one by one through each of these and have you flesh them out. Does that work?
Yeah, great.
Okay, let's do it. All right, so number 1 is starting with executive team culture. This is really interesting. So like you said, instead of jumping to kind of compensation models or blowing things up and doing something really innovative, it sort of starts at the top. Talk to us a little bit about what that even means. Like what type of culture should an executive team be trying to cultivate as it relates to our topic, teacher retention, sustainability?
Yeah. I think one thing I want to say before going deep into that is that a lot of what we heard here and what's in this report is about going back to basics. And I think post-pandemic leaders across the country have been really focused on stabilizing and trying to get back to some kind of new normal. And some of the things that made us really successful before we all went through that got a little lost. And some of it got lost because there's been leadership transition. Some of it got lost because we're dealing with new challenges that are really unprecedented, like student behavior issues or attendance or, some of these other things that are really foundational to educating kids. And so all of these are things that are not, they're pretty obvious. And so I just want to name that this isn't, revolutionary stuff. This is stuff that we know how to do. It's about going back to those basics. So on the executive team culture piece, we kept hearing over and over about how there was this ripple effect on teacher retention stemming from the decisions made by the executive team, big decisions, small decisions. And the way that played out was when the executive teams were responsive to staff feedback, to shifting their approach to issues like prep periods and classroom coverage or curriculum. We have to remember those decisions affect the daily life of a teacher and their day-to-day experience. And so if in your exec team room, in those conversations, you are having healthy and honest collaborative conversations, you are looking at data honestly and using staff feedback and input to drive decision making. You're having transparent and thoughtful, human-centered conversations and communicating in that way. That flows down to school leaders, to principals, and then to staff. And so that's how we believe that this executive team culture work really does have an impact ultimately on the day-to-day experience of teachers.
Is it fair to say that the inverse is, or I should say, is it fair to say that if teacher retention at the local level is a challenge, it is important to go back as an executive team and have a hard conversation first as a group about why this might be happening? I mean, like, to your point, I could see, a board or a room of executives, especially at a bigger network where maybe it's like, I'm the CFO. What do I have to do with the math teacher at one of our 10 elementary campuses? But it seems like what you're saying is this really starts at the top, and that core group needs to kind of prioritize their own environment before they can address kind of systemic or organization-wide culture. It sounds like that's what you're
Absolutely.
encouraging.
There was a common trend over and over that we saw that these exec teams that had these high retention rates, one, they named retention as a priority as a team, that they owned those outcomes together. So they didn't just put it on the chief people officer, the chief talent officer, or if you're small, you have one school, two schools, on the person who does HR or hiring, but that it's a shared responsibility, and that it's multifaceted in how teachers experience their day to day. Teacher retention isn't just about the intent to return process and a stay conversation, right? Teacher retention is actually about your day-to-day experience with your manager, with your principal, with other people, your peers in the building, with how you experience change, et cetera.
When you were having these conversations with exec teams, did you see any like one of the things you really encouraged was, being open to feedback? And we'll talk more about that in a second. Did you see common trends just around like the ways communication was funneled up the chain of command? Did that look similar across organizations that had these successful exec cultures? Or did you find that, practically there's not really one way to run your executive team and it's more about these kind of core principles?
I think that honestly, your exec team culture is going to stem from your leader, and every leader is dramatically different. And that's the exciting part of the work. And so when we work with our CEOs, and oftentimes we're giving, advice or we're sharing resources, we always say, but you need to tailor this to your culture and what makes sense and how you operate. So if XYZ is not normal for you, don't do that, because that's not authentic. So we're not pushing anyone or encouraging folks to take on tactics or ways of doing things that are inauthentic to their leadership. I think that is why it's so important for CEOs and exec teams to have these open and honest conversations to figure out, how do they want to lead? How do they want to listen? How do they want to take feedback and be responsive to it?
All right. Well, that's a perfect segue into our second insight. So, number two was build structures to routinize listening and understanding. And I want to actually read a small excerpt from the report and have you respond to this. So, it reads, based on what charter leaders are hearing from staff, the original charter school employee value proposition of students first no longer resonates with our emerging workforce. We must consider how to go from students first to people centric in a way that creates conditions for belonging for both the adults and the students in our buildings. Could you just talk to us about what that means exactly, and what are people seeing in terms of kind of the statement that the original EVP is no longer really resonating?
We've seen this through some data from teachers around like what compels them. And this students first mantra is not necessarily the thing that excites folks anymore. We're not making a sweeping
Sure. Yeah.
statement around that. That's not everybody, but that's generally what we've heard. I think that comes down to is how do we get excellent academic outcomes for kids, provide them with an academic experience that they deserve, but not do it at the expense of the adults who are educating and caring for them. And we think that's possible. That may not mean that's everyone's approach, but we think if that's something that people believe in and they want to do, that they can do it. I think it requires us to be more human-centered, to care for our teams, to be thoughtful about how we're delivering feedback, how we're treating our staff who are working so hard to do right by kids every day. And again, that looks different in every school or network, but it is really actually also about people skills and about truly listening to what people's needs are and not sort of operating in this really like head down, data is the only thing that matters kind of way, but really looking at everything holistically to make sure that when our teachers and leaders are healthy and they feel cared for, they are going to do their best work. And that is where we want them.
Totally. Yeah. So talk to us about like practically what does it look like? The title of this insight was to have regular listening spaces, which seems to indicate that this is not once a year checking in with people. So I guess two questions. Like one, practically, what does it look like to operationalize this for the people who are, operations brain? Give me the XYZ of what this could look like. And then the follow-up to that would be, what would you say, having worked in schools, what the environment is like and how challenging it can be day to day. What would you say to those who feel like, Zainab, there's no more time for more meetings, and like I can hardly get a one-on-one with my, teacher coaches. How am I supposed to create all these listening spaces?
I think that when it's worked into the cadence of your school year versus being reactive when people are upset, then it doesn't feel like it's an extra piece of work, right? If you have formal and informal listening channels already baked into your arc of the year, and you do something with what you're hearing and you incorporate it into what you're doing and how you're learning about the work in a thoughtful and meaningful way, it should feel like that is the way you do the work and you lead the work. And that can look different for everybody. It doesn't have to be cookie cutter, but I think it needs to have some sort of component of surveys, ideally anonymized, pulse check surveys. So if we do a twice a year staff sat survey, we shouldn't go, 5 months without dipsticking to see how people are doing. We know when we work in schools, October is a really rough time. We know that in January, people come back excited and energized. So we already know what those emotions are like during the year. And then obviously when things happen, sometimes things are unexpected, but we know what it already looks like. And so we should be dipsticking at various times to see what can we be doing differently? Are we on the right track? Is this a moment where we just need to come together to support each other? What can we do to support each other? So that's, I think, hopefully, I know a little bit of a vague answer, but I think it needs to be worked into sort of the fabric of how you do all of your work, as opposed to feeling like an extra additive optional thing. And one other thing I would say on that, office hours are not the answer. Teachers who are struggling and upset are not coming to your office hours.
Right. Newsflash. Yeah.
Newsflash.
PSA.
And so You have to go to them and figure out what's authentic to you to be able to go and hear from them.
All right. So part of sourcing feedback is also actually trying to implement change when you hear that feedback. This is sort of the other common complaint you often hear from teachers or folks who work in education is, I've told my administration 9,000 times that this is crushing all of us and things need to change. And so, number 3 on your list here is model and teach change management. This implies that change is going to happen and that you're going to be a responsive organization that implements strategic measures to improve, teacher retention and sustainability. So, a common challenge is poor change management. Change management's really hard. There's whole consulting firms that help people do change management. What have you noticed or found through this research around the impact of change and change management on staff retention? Long-winded question, sorry.
No, yeah. I mentioned this earlier that oftentimes when we're leading change, and I don't think there's a leader I talked to this year who doesn't have some kind of change that is planned for this school year. And so, but when we're leading change, we have to recognize that it does impact teachers. It does impact our staff in schools, even if you are a large network or a small school. If you have to reduce the number of staff because of a loss of enrollment or because of the ESSER fund sunsetting or whatever it might be, the staff who remain are still impacted. They may be impacted psychologically. They may be impacted because they have fewer colleagues around to share in the workload. That is not a very positive example, but I think we have to just remember that change does have this ripple effect. And sometimes it may feel like, oh, well, this change only impacts 15 people or 25 people. But really, it is something that people are internalizing. They're reading the emails or they're hearing through their friends or colleagues during lunch or in the hallway. And so we have to be really mindful of what that impact is on people's day-to-day experience.
What are some simple ways a leadership team can improve or better model change management? Some of those organizations you interviewed where they're doing change really well. What were some of the things you noticed?
I think overarching my observation is that when change is rushed, when people aren't planning it out with enough time to do some of the steps I'm going to talk about, that is where we see a lot of things go wrong. The experience on the other side is pretty negative. And so, first, I think incorporate stakeholder voice from the outset. That doesn't always mean that the voice is 100% in alignment with the direction you're going, but it also means narrating what you've heard and how it informs what you're doing. And sometimes I tell leaders, like, that also means saying, and we also heard this, and we're not going to be able to do that, and here's why. Let's name it. Like, let's talk about it. Let's be honest and have open conversations with our teachers who are professionals, and they deserve that kind of conversation. To share the changes in multiple ways, not just one long email, right? We are used to writing really beautiful, pithy emails with photos and powerful statements and quotes to our funders, to our elected officials. But then we send emails to our staff that are 5 pages long. And then 3 months later, we're like, what do you mean you didn't understand the new comp system? We sent an email about it in March.
Right. You didn't read that word for word? Come on.
And so we also have to remember that adults learn and absorb information in different ways, just like our students do. So is it a video? Is it a road show? Is it a conversation, one-on-ones? I know that's hard work, but if we're doing change in the right way, we're thinking about how we're delivering the message. It could be a flyer in the break room, like there should be multiple ways you are communicating this change. And then you should build capacity in your leaders closest to staff to do this well. A number of our networks have started providing PD for principals, for school leaders in change management. And I think that has had a really strong sort of impact on when they are leading change. And then finally, check in on how things are going and make the announcement. You send the email and hopefully deliver the information in a few different ways, but do follow up and see, how is it going? How are people feeling? Is this working the way we intended? And if not, maybe we need to make some changes on the margins in order to meet the needs of our staff or our community. And then share back how it's going. Tell that story. Tell what's going well, what's not going well. Talk about what you're doing about it, and share testimonials. I love to hear when we have change and then teachers are saying, actually, this new curriculum has been so powerful for my students. And here is an example of how it moved my students' reading skills. And so this could be for anything from instructional changes to comp, sometimes stuff that's like really not sexy, like benefits. So those are the things that we learned are sort of the tenets of change going well.
Some of this, like you said at the beginning, can feel basic, but there's little nuances. Like, I just want to point out one of the things you said, which was share back also what's not going well. That little change helps so many people who maybe have complaints that they're not voicing feel like, oh yeah, they get it. Like, there's this big project isn't all, flowers. Some things are going well and some things are not going well. And it seems like a lot of these recommendations are kind of interconnected. If you're doing change, you should have your regular listening spaces already incorporated where you could then maybe check feedback on that particular, change that's going on in the organization. So a lot of these feel interconnected.
I once got advice from someone who said, anytime you're communicating and you say something that might be true for the majority of people, but for a handful of people is not true, it actually causes harm to them. So if you are touting that you have a 25-1, teacher to student ratio, but there's 20 teachers who that's not true for, they're going to read that and they're going to roll their eyes. They're going to feel frustrated. It's actually going to make them feel worse about their situation. And so when you are talking about change and you're like, this change is so amazing, it's going so well, it's been seamless, we're so proud, and we don't acknowledge where there have been bumps or pain points, then those people who've experienced those bumps and pain points are actually going to have a worse experience because they're going to feel like you aren't seeing the reality of the impact. And so I think that that's spot on.
Totally. One of the things you mentioned just in passing, as we were just talking about change management, was seeing certain organizations even invest in professional development for principals or site level campus leaders, which is insight number 4, which is invest in principal development and keep your best teachers, retain those top performers. I think it's fair. Someone could make an argument that the school principal might be the hardest job in America. You are dealing with upset parents, you're managing teachers. It's a day-to-day grind. What did your study reveal about developing principals?
Well, I think first is that, like other sectors, the principal, the manager, is one of the top reasons most teachers choose to stay or go. So you can work for an incredible organization, but if your manager, your principal doesn't listen, doesn't take feedback well, isn't a great coach, isn't helping you develop, that may be the make or break situation for whether you go or not. And so we have to recognize how important that leader's role is on retention. And so what this can look like is having a point of view on how you are developing principals. It's not, we know that those first couple years, especially for principals or principals even who are tenured and have been around, they sometimes can also struggle as the demands or as the job is shifting. And so we have to have a point of view. Like, what do we believe is going to be the way that we are going to develop and support and coach our principals? And how are we investing in that? And so some networks we talk to, they use, this is not novel, but they use data to differentiate or tier supports that principals receive. Others have a very regular and religious cadence on the ground coaching for principals on a weekly or biweekly basis. That requires an investment, right, in who those coaches are and having a team that can coach, right, internally or, consultants, whatever it might be. We saw really, I think I mentioned this earlier, great success with coaching and teaching change management for leaders. creating collaborative cultures amongst cohorts of principals so they can learn from each other. When you're in your own school building, like that job is lonely. It is challenging. And so having a community that you can commiserate with, that you can problem solve with, that you can share resources with so that you're not reinventing the wheel is very empowering and is another development tool. And this year I heard actually at Alliance, their principals are part of their leadership team. So they actually meet with their home office leadership and principals to exercise voice, give input on the direction of the organization. And that ensures that, the direction of the org is not moving forward without them and their experiences being reflected.
So the principals are kind of the beacon of the organization at the site level. The teachers are obviously driving what's happening on the front lines with students. And any organization, it doesn't have to be education. There's nothing more devastating than losing one of your best employees. They bring energy, they bring innovation, they attract other good people, they have positive outcomes. This was the second part of your insight. So, how are organizations keeping their best teachers? And I also wanted to ask you about the opposite of this, which is, are those same organizations being intentional about offboarding underperforming teachers?
Yeah, that wasn't something we explicitly addressed in the study, but we addressed like no longer settling for low quality teachers. There was a point in the pandemic where folks were in such challenging circumstances that they were hiring quickly without a robust selection process. I think data shows that the number of non-credentialed teachers skyrocketed. And anecdotally, we heard from leaders across the country that they just needed a person in the classroom. We are no longer in that place, thankfully.
Yeah.
I think we're still trying to recover from some of that, but the leaders we spoke to agree. We can no longer to keep teachers for the sake of just filling the role. I heard yesterday from a charter network that they are differentiating some of their compensation bands for their harder to recruit teachers. And they are also implementing signing bonuses for those roles. So realizing, okay, yes, there aren't as many of these teachers maybe for special ed or for STEM in high school, but then what do we need to be doing differently to get a high quality teacher in that classroom? And I think, another element of this is about saying, who are we? What do we do? And who are we not as an organization when you are hiring? So there aren't surprises, so there isn't a mismatch. And so that when you are bringing people, you're investing in all of those months of onboarding and development, you're actually losing money and resources in that turnover. So investing early on and upfront in your process to make sure there is really strong alignment is also really important.
Well, our fifth and last insight that you all came up with was insisting on a high bar for teachers, which we were just talking about, and for teacher hires as you're recruiting and investing in those first 2 years. I think, if you've been around education for a while, the stats around teachers leaving the profession in the first 2 years. It feels like, you said we're kind of moving out of this period, but it does feel like there's been sort of this double-edged sword where there's all these open positions, but then you want to say as an organization, no, we have a high bar for teachers. How do we balance that? So what does a high bar necessarily mean? And maybe, what could it look like to pump resources, intentionality into those first couple of years?
I think that the organizations who do this well know what their successful profile is. So some of them actually go to those teachers who have been there for 5, 6, 8, 10 years and say, what keeps you here? What makes you successful? Sometimes that seems really obvious, but sometimes we don't ask those questions. And I think the answers are there. That might be slightly different for our younger folks coming into the field because what motivates them is going to be a little bit different than a teacher who's been teaching for 10 years. But generally, we should start there and listen to what attracts them. I think on the high bar, I think we have to know what makes a successful teacher in our environment. That is not the same for every charter school or every charter network because the expectations are also different. So you have to develop a point of view and know what that is and hire against it. A lot of folks have been talking about investing more in internal pipelines and grow your own. And we've seen a lot of success in that. We've seen a lot of the organizations that have the strongest cultures and the strongest academic outcomes. They have these internal pipelines. It is hard to do, but it is worthy of the investment. And I think the other thing to just think about here is that you've never talked to a teacher who said, oh, that first year was great.
Yeah. I knocked it out of the park. It was amazing. Yeah.
So
exactly what I hoped it would be.
exactly. So, and sometimes actually it's the opposite. People are like, it was harrowing.
Yeah.
And so if we know that, that is not a secret. That's not anything that's specific to 2024. That's how people felt 20 years ago and when they were entering the profession. So if we know that, then what are we doing to make that experience better? How are we investing in support for those teachers, not just the first year, but that second year? And I think when a lot of people look at their retention data, they see that between that second and third years where they have a lot of attrition, or between that third and fourth year. And so what is our point of view about teacher development those first couple of years? How are we investing in it? What does that cadence look like? Who owns it? Who manages that? Who's responsible for it? How are we holding people accountable to making sure that teachers have that support and development? Sometimes that's a mentor teacher program. Sometimes someone who's actually checking in on you, right? We talked about how October is really a low morale month. Like, who's checking on you in October, and how are they coming to support you? And so there's all these little things that you can do culturally, and then things instructionally you can do to ensure that they are feeling like they can grow and that they have the tools to do so.
All right. So as we wrap up here, I'm going to give us the quick rundown. 5 insights. Start with executive team culture, number 1. Number 2, build structures to routinize listening and understanding. That's number 2. Number 3, model and teach change management. Number 4, invest in principal development and retention to keep your best teachers. And number 5, what we were just talking about, insist on that high bar and invest heavily in those first 2 years. None of those things, believe it or not, are the 4-day work week or free Chipotle or anything else. So back to the basics. Zainab, thank you so much for coming to share what you learned and some great takeaways for leaders who might be listening to this. For those who found the conversation helpful, who are interested in learning more about kind of your work, or the Charter School Growth Fund, where should we send them?
I believe they can check out the summary and your show notes. They can email me and reach out at zali@chartergrowthfund.org. I'm happy to, share further insights or answer any questions. But I hope this was helpful. And thanks so much, Daniel, for having me on.
Thanks for listening to Charter School Insider. This show is brought to you by BuyQ, the group purchasing organization specifically for charter schools. Want to learn how to maximize your school's purchasing power? Join together with thousands of other charter schools by visiting buyq.org/sign-up. BuyQ's purchasing program is free and has no obligations or commitments required. If you enjoyed today's episode, do us a favor and subscribe on your podcast listening platform of choice. If you have a question or feedback for us, we'd love to hear from you. Send us an email at podcast@byq.org. Thanks, and we hope you'll tune in for the next one.